So I want to go through maybe drawing a chair and an elliptical object, and then I'm going to get you guys into drawing the gridded room, and I'll have a homework assignment that'll go with that, but I just want to do that quick review before we get to that. So let's start the drawing the way we did last time. Find the middle of your page, which in the 24-inch paper would be 12 inches in, and put in your center line of vision. And put this station point at the bottom. So, does anybody remember what we do from here? How we find the ground line and the eye level, or no? No? That's okay if you don't. I just wanted to see if anybody... No? So let's determine how big our unit of measurement is going to be going into this drawing. So let's say 1 inch equals 1 foot. So let's say our station point is going to be 5 feet back from the ground line. So that means that it's 5 inches back from the ground line. Let me measure up on the center line from the station point. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's going to be where my ground line is going to come in. We're going to put that down. And then put the 1 inch marks along the ground line. It will be a guide to creating whatever objects we want. That makes sense so far? Everybody with me? Yeah? Just put the little GL so you can reference it. This is the ground line. And our CLV at the top for our center line of vision. Okay, so now that we have a ground line in, I want to calculate up to make a decision on where we want our eye level to be. So why don't we go like we did, I think the last one we went with a eye level that was 6 feet off the ground. So let's go with that same one again. So from the ground line, I'm going to measure up 6 inches because 1 inch equates to 1 foot in our drawing. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's going to be where our eye level is coming in. Put horizontal across. That's our eye level. Put an EL. And then right where our center line and eye level cross, there's going to be our vanishing point. So does anybody remember what we have to set up to start to calculate back into space, to count back into space once we start building something? Started with an M. Yeah, what were they called? Anybody remember? Measurement points? So last time I talked about the measurement points being calculated by putting down that a 90-degree angle on the station point and having the center line cut it in half. Which you can do. If you have a protractor, you can do it really accurately. But then there's another way to find your measurement points. If you take the distance from the vanishing point here to the station point here, that distance would be equal to the distance from the vanishing point to the measurement point we're going to establish. Does that make sense? Yeah? So in our particular drawing, what is the measurement from the vanishing point to the station point? How many inches? It's 5 plus 6. Nobody remembers what 5 plus 6 is? 11, yeah, because we had 5 feet to the ground line and then 6 feet from the ground line to the eye level. So we're going to go 11 inches over from the vanishing point on the eye level. Let me do it this way. And that will be our measurement point. We'll call that MP1. Okay. And then we can do the same thing on the other side to establish a corresponding measurement point. Call that MP2. And if we just, you don't have to do this, but just to kind of show you, if I go from the measurement point 2 and I go down to my station point right there, and I go from measurement point 1 and I go down to the station point and line it up, you'll notice that we get that 90-degree angle again. So you could, with equal validity, put a 90-degree angle down there, like we did last time, extend it up to where it hits the eye level and find your measurement points, or you can take the distance from the vanishing point to the station point and measure it over on each side on the eye level, and you'd also get your measurement point. So 2 different ways, equally valid. As long as you get there, that's all that really counts. So we're going to draw a chair last time, a basic chair, so it's not too overwhelming too soon. So you want to draw the chair on the right side or the left side of the center line? Any thoughts on that, or does it matter? Maybe we did the table on the left side last time. Maybe we'll do the chair on the right side then. Yeah? So maybe we'll do a chair on the right side, and let's say we're going to be 1 foot over from the center line of vision. So I'm going to go down to the ground line where the center line is intersecting. Just go 1 inch over, because 1 inch equals 1 foot. And then I'm going to take a line lightly but clearly to my vanishing point. I say lightly but clearly because I don't want it to distract from the actual object I'm in the drawing. I want it to be a guideline. So then we have to decide how wide do we want this chair to be. If we're looking at, let's say we're going to look at the chair from a profile kind of point of view, how wide do we want it to be from back to front? Any thoughts on that? What's that?
A wide chair?
You wanted to do... Actually, maybe we'll do this. I don't mean to confuse anybody with this, but this might help when calculating things that are less than a foot. Why don't we do a chair that is 1.5 feet from the back to the front? Okay? So can anybody figure out what we would do if we want to go from this point and we wanted to go 1.5 feet over? What would we have to do? If 1 inch equals 1 foot and each one of these marks is representing 1 inch, how far over would we go for 1.5 feet? Any thoughts? If 1 inch equals 1 foot, and we're going 1.5 feet over, that would be how many inches? 1.5 inches, yes. So we're going to go 1.5 inches over for the equivalent of 1.5 feet. Make that little mark right there. So right at that spot, I'm going to do another line, lightly but clearly, back to my vanishing point. So I've got the width set in. Now I have to decide, do I want this chair to be right on the ground line, or do I want to push it back in space, back farther from the ground line? Let's say that we're going to have the chair a foot back from the ground line, a foot back in space. Anybody remember how we count back in space from here? What's that? Well, yeah. Well, so if I want to go back on this line 1 foot, where would I line it up to, you think? Yeah. So if I go from my measurement point and I cross it over and line it up here, that's 1 foot over from where the chair is going to begin. And by lining it up here, that helps me calculate 1 foot back into space. And remember, even though the chair, this could be anything. It could be a chair, it could be, a car, any kind of ornate object, but the structure of this object is what's more important at this stage before we worry about details. Getting it placed properly in space and getting the structure in. So I'm going to line up from the measurement point 1 foot over from where the chair begins, and right where it overlaps this line, right there, there's 1 foot back into space. Everybody remember that? Yeah? So now all I have to do is take this line and go straight across and stop right there, and I've got the base of what will be the chair and the overall width kind of laid into the ground. So there it goes. That make sense? Yeah? Okay. So then I have to decide, well, if we're going to have a chair that's, we'll put a note here, that's 1.5 feet wide, how far back do I want it to be? In other words, how far back in space, I should say. Let me clarify that. How far back in space? Because we know we want it to be 1.5 feet from front to back, or from back to front rather. How far back do I want it to go back in space now from this point? So, yeah, we can go 1.5 feet if you wanted. So, if you want to go 1.5 feet back from this point, how do you think we would calculate that?
Similarly, just go half instead of the full 1.
Okay, so to calculate back from this point, we lined up there because it was 1 foot over, we pushed it back. So if I want to calculate 1.5 feet back from this point was based on the alignment to here, which means if I want to go back 1.5 feet from this point, I would go back to this, follow this back down, and then go 1.5 feet, and then line that up with the measurement point, and that would bring it up and show me what 1.5 feet back into space is from that point. Does that make sense? Yeah? Let me just make sure I'm right in the middle there. Again, I realize this is very technical at the moment, but the more you do it, the more instinctive it becomes. So the more fluid it will become. It won't feel so stringent. You just got to be willing to do it for a while. So I'm just going to follow that back up. Right where it hits that line, there's the equivalent from this point of 1.5 feet back into space. So I have the base of the chair down. We've decided we want the chair to be basically a square in terms of the overall front to back and side to side kind of shape. Now I have to decide, well, we're going to do it in a profile kind of view. Do I want the back of the chair to be here, or do I want the backrest of the chair to be on this side? Which side do you want? I'm indifferent. I can go either way. This side? It would be what now?
I feel like that's harder since the side.
You think this side would be harder? Putting on this side you feel is harder?
Making the chair for sideways would be harder, so probably sideways.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do, but I mean, if we're going to have the back of the chair here, or do you want to have the back of the chair here? Right there?
Harder. Yeah.
Okay, so you want to do something that's harder. Good. That's a good attitude to have. So we're going to have the backrest of the chair here, and now we have to decide how tall do we want the chair to be from the base where it hits the ground all the way to the top of the backrest. How tall should it be? If it's 2 feet wide, or 1.5 feet wide rather, how tall should it be? Let's see how tall this chair is, just as a reference point. This one's about almost 2 feet, so or 4 feet rather. So why don't we say this chair is going to be from the bottom all the way to the top, it's going to be 4 feet tall. In other words, from the base where it hits the ground all the way to the top of the backrest. Does that make sense? Yeah? So I need to go from this point, I need to count up in space, from that point in space, I need to count up 4 feet. Does anybody remember how we did that last time? Because we used the ground line to count the ground plane back into space. If we want to count up, what do you think we should use? What's the middle one called? It'll be on the midterm test, so it's good to know it now. CLV. What does CLV stand for? Center.
Oh, center line.
Center line of vision. So I need to go on the center line of vision and make some little marks of 1-inch marks to indicate feet up into space. There's 1 foot, hold on, 1 foot, 2 feet, 3 feet, 4. I'll just do all the way up to the eye level. So, where's my, okay. So basically I want to use this as a guide to count up, but I want to count up ultimately in the end from that point. So what I need to do is figure out a way to transfer the measurements here over to this point accurately and efficiently. So what I'm going to do, let's imagine for a moment, here's our center line and we got our little 1-inch dashes, right? If I move this horizontal down to the right or left on that center line, it still equates to 1 inch equaling 1 foot up in space, right? So I'm going to move this, let's say, over to here. I'm going to put a light but clear vertical line. And then real quickly, I'm just going to hold on. Let me get an eraser real quick. That's a crooked line. So let me adjust that. Make sure it goes straight vertical. So lightly but clearly up. Let's put a little dash. There's 1 inch, 2, 3, 4. So if we compare it to the center line, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 feet high in space. However, the problem right now is that's 4 feet from the ground line. I want to be 4 feet up from this point. So the way I'm going to do that, let's imagine for a moment, for those of you who forgot, that this light line that I just drew, this light vertical line, let's imagine that's a stake in the ground, a straight stick going straight up. And from that point that's 4 feet up, let's imagine that I'm going to be tying a string to it and pulling it back into space. In this particular case, because that string is parallel to the ground plane, we would line it up with the vanishing point. So I'm just going to go like that. Right? So let's everybody can see that clearly? Yeah? Let's imagine that that line is a string we're pulling back into space. So that would mean if I go along this line right here is parallel to this one. Yeah, everybody understand that? Okay? So that means at any point along this line, if I go straight up, wherever I intersect the one I just drew, that would be the equivalent of 4 feet up in space, bar back into space, right? So if I go to here, let's say, hypothetically, and I go straight up and I hit this line, that's 4 feet high back in space, that far back. So what I'm going to do is go to that corner right there and just draw a straight line up, and where it intersects this line I just drew, that's the equivalent of 4 feet high back in space starting at that point. Does that make sense? Yeah? And I realize right now, just for anybody who's confused, I realize that the line I'm drawing right now is right near this line that came off the center line, but the reason they're so close is that I'm only 1 foot back in space from the center line, okay? So it intersects right there. That would be the top. Make that a little bit darker so it's easier to see. So if I want to get the opposing side right here, all I got to do is go from that corner, go straight up, and where it hits that same line that went back into space, that's 4 feet up from that point. And just so I don't get confused, I'm going to erase this first line that I initially started with, this first little dot, because that was coming off the ground line. I don't want it to be a distraction later in the drawing. Remember, these converging lines are guidelines to build our object. So there's the first dot, there's the second one, and there automatically is the angle of the top of the backrest of the chair. Let me zoom in just a little bit so it's a little easier to see. All right, so now we have to think from the base of the chair, how high up are we going to be to the spot where people would actually sit down, where the cushion would be? Let's see what this chair is. This one is, hold on. This one's about 1.5 feet. So this one, if I go, in this chair I'm sitting in, if I go up from the base to where I'm sitting, it's about 1.5 feet. Okay. Again, I don't want to confuse everybody by cutting up everything in half as we count this, but I do want to explain how you would do those things, because you are going to run into situations where something is not an exact foot. It's a 1/2 foot, it's a quarter, it's, you know, whatever. So I want to count up 1.5 feet from here. So the way I'm going to do that is basically the same way I counted up before. I can just go back to where I started right there and go 1.5 inches up, take that 1.5 inch line, take it back to my vanishing point, and where it intersects the two lines I drew earlier, then that's 1.5 feet up in space from those points. Yeah? Now, I think I brought this up in last class, but remember, you know, any problem you run into with drawing or painting anything, as long as you logically think through your problem, you'll find the solution. Even if you're intending to be very surrealistic or whatever, everything is based on logical relationships. So don't think that having to calculate is not being creative. It's exactly what it's being. You're being creative by calculating, making these decisions. So that's 1.5 feet up on that initial line that I drew coming off of that point. Now I'm just going to take it back to the vanishing point, and where it intersects these two lines, right here, right there. Let me zoom in so you can see. Where it intersects there and there, that's your 1.5 feet back in space along the chair. Make sense? What's that?
How to measure the chair?
The height up?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this was that little light line was the initial one I used to find my overall height of the chair, right? Okay. So before I measured up 4 feet, okay? But now I want to go up from that same line, and I just want to find the equivalent of 1.5 feet. So I just go back to the initial spot that I started to find the overall height, and instead of going up 4 inches like I did before, I just go up 1.5 inches on that line, and then I take it to the vanishing point, and where it crosses over, that equates to the 1.5 feet for the base of the chair. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So now all I got to do is just go across, and then across there, and I've got the beginning of the base of the chair and the legs that will be coming in for the chair.
I got lost.
What'd you get lost on?
Kind of the lines.
Here?
Yeah.
Okay. So do you remember this vertical line we did earlier? That vertical line, we measured up 4 inches and then pushed it back, and that was found the top? Okay. We're going to do the same thing, but this time we only want to go 1.5 inches because we're only going 1.5 feet up. So I went 1.5 inches up, lined up that corner with the vanishing point, and where it intersects those two lines that were the back of the chair, that's the equivalent of 1.5 feet up for the base, for where we would sit. Right? So I'm going to use those two dots as a guide to finding the front of the chair, which all I got to do is just take that over and then take that up, and I've automatically found the front of the chair. You can kind of see why we're starting with basic objects first. And not getting anything too ornate just yet. We will, but I don't want to get into it yet and confuse everybody too soon. And I'm also at this stage, I'm thinking of this chair in a, I want to say somewhat transparent manner, meaning that I'm thinking of drawing through the form, knowing that I can erase the draw-throughs later on. So here's the far side of the chair. I'm just going to take that over. And then from this point, which was that corner, I take that back to the vanishing point because it's parallel with everything else. And now we've got the opposing corner on the far side of that chair. Make sense? Yeah? I'll come around and make sure everybody's on track. All right, so we've got the basic structure of the chair in, right? We need to add a couple of things in terms of the width of the seat and the width of the backrest and all of that. But once that's done, which we'll do here in a second, then we could turn this chair into a really ornate chair if we wanted to, like something that would be in like a castle or something like that, like a throne or whatever we wanted it to be. So I need to decide the backrest here, how far over in the chair do I want it to go, right? Because obviously if this backrest here, it's not paper thin, it comes up, you know. So let's say we'll go, we'll make the backrest equivalent to the width of the leg of the chair that we're going to make right there, right? So let's say we don't, if you wanted to, you could calculate this over on the ground line. I don't think it's completely necessary, but let's say we're going to go a short distance over, maybe just over 1/8 of an inch, hypothetically, roundabout. So if I go from that and I go straight up, I've got the leg of the chair. If I continue to go up, I can square it off right there and I've got the thickness of the backrest. Right? So just watch what I'm going to do real quick. So I'm going from the leg of the chair where we counted back in space, going over a short distance. I'm going to go straight up. And I want the backrest to be equivalent to the width of the leg of the chair here. So there's the overall height to the top. I go from that top corner, it's closest to me, and I just go over and we square that off. And make these lines a little heavier to kind of differentiate them from the converging lines. There's my width. Now if that's the top corner, that top corner going back into space, that edge would be parallel to this, therefore it's going to go to the same vanishing point. And then there's that back corner there, we'll just go across. And we see just a little sliver of the back of the chair because we're only a foot over from the center line. If we were to go, if we had this chair farther over from the center line, we'd see more of the back right here. But because we're only a foot, we're only seeing a short distance for that area, a little sliver of it. And then, so does that make sense? What I just said? And then I want to do the same thing here. I want to have the leg of the chair that's equivalent to this one. So a quick, easy way to do that, just take that distance, bring it over to there, and then the edge, the inner edge of that chair is going to be parallel to all the other lines going to the vanishing point, so I just take a line right to the vanishing point. And if that's the corner, I just go straight up. And there's my corner there. Now I need to decide, make that line a little bit clearer. Easy to read. One quick note, you can kind of tell right now where this intersected. Let me zoom into this so you don't. You can see it clearly on the screen. This line intersected the back edge of the alignments we did earlier there, so that's where the width of the leg of the chair in the back would go to. So I would just go straight up from there. And I'm going to go over this with a ballpoint pen, the actual object, to differentiate it a little more clearly from the converging lines here in a minute. There's my height. All right? Does that make sense? So now I need to decide how wide I want the leg of the chair to be going back in space. Now here's another thing that, to decide that width going back into space, the approach would be no different than how we counted back into space before. The only real difference is that we're dealing with a shorter amount of space. So we would just calculate on the ground line that short distance and transfer it back up the way we did previously. That's obviously a little bit tedious, so I don't think we need to do that right now for what we're doing. But just so you understand the logic, counting back on this line would be the same as I counted back on any other line. Okay? So I'm just going to make a decision that I want it to be roughly that wide back, right? So if we think of this and we're looking at it from a close-up, hold on, let me grab a scrap sheet. If we're thinking of this from a close-up point of view, there's the leg of the chair, and we're thinking of that little section there where it's going to stop, where we're going to have the other side, because there's the front plane, which is this, then the side plane, which is that, and we're figuring out where we want this to be. I'm just going to make a decision. I want it to end there. All right? So all I got to do is go straight up. And now I've got the width of the back of that chair, or the width of the side of the leg of the chair. I can do the same thing here. What I want that to be. Again, we're talking about such a short distance here, I don't think we need to overly calculate it along the ground line, although you could do that and transfer it back up if you wanted to. So I'm just going to end that leg there. Bring that across, and where it hits that line, that would be the equivalent. I see just a sliver of that corner. And then we have the base of the chair. So now I'm getting down to the smaller shape. So like I said earlier, we deal with the big structure, then we slowly work down to the smaller shapes once the bigger shapes have been locked in. And stop me if you get stuck. Okay, I don't want to confuse anybody or go too fast. So here, that's where that little, right there we see, that's where the corner was going to be. There's a little bit of a horizontal that's parallel with that one. We just go straight up from that point. And there's that little sliver of the angle we see just because it's only slightly over from the center line. I got the legs of my chair. And now I need to make a decision for how thick do I want the seat of the chair to be, right? Because again, if it's paper thin, you're going to fall right through it. So let's say we're going to come up to about there. From this point to here for our thickness of the seat of the chair. And I bring that up. And then that corner is parallel to all these other lines moving back into space, so we're going to take that to the vanishing point. And then take this right here all the way back. Actually, no, excuse me. Take that over, put a little dot there. And right where it hits, right here, as we're going along, again, if we think about this, grab another scrap sheet. If we think about this area right here, we've got the leg of the chair, it's going back in space. We have the other leg of the chair back there, it's going back. What I'm looking for is the back edge of that chair as it goes where the seat would be. So if we've already established, here's the width of the front plane, I'm just taking this line over to here, and then taking from that point, lining that up with the vanishing point, and I automatically transfer that width accurately back to the back of the chair. Okay? Because these are going to the VP, because they're parallel. Okay? So I did that and transferred it back, that dot hit there. I'm going to just draw through from that point. It hits the corner right there, so there's the front of the chair and the corrected height. So now we have the thickness of the seat of where somebody would sit into it. Okay? And at this point, if we wanted to, now that we have the correct perspective and the structure down, we could draw on top of this and turn it into whatever kind of ornate chair, whatever little tiny details and textures and designs, make it like I say, a king's throne or whatever we wanted it to be, a chair in a spaceship or whatever. But the perspective would be laid in properly given what we determined we wanted our eye level to be. And sometimes people put tracing paper over it, use this as the guide and turn it into whatever. Like I'm gonna just draw this over with a pen so it's a little bit more clearly defined. But I guess now you could say if you wanted to make something more ornate, now is when the fun part would come in because the basic perspective has been laid in. But again, this was based on the idea that we wanted this chair to be below our eye level and 1 foot away from the ground line. If you wanted it to be positioned differently, we'd do the exact same approach. We would just make sure to calculate it properly relative to our ground line and our center line and our eye level. Any questions so far about anything? Anything that doesn't make sense? Anything anybody got confused on? Because again, I don't want to do this so fast that everybody gets lost. So in here, there's our center line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. 2, 3, 4. So this line, 4 feet off the ground, and our vanishing point was way up here. There's the base of the chair. Our chair was starting, let's say, right there. That means if I take this to the vanishing point, that was 4 feet. That means this line is 4 feet off the ground all the way back into space. Where I go from here and I go straight up, as soon as it hits that, that's the equivalent of 4 feet in that spot. If I go over to here and go straight up, that's the 4 feet in that spot. From there, straight up, that's 4 feet.
But the paper measure 4 feet.
No, we're transferring it back because, you know, as we go in perspective, things get smaller. They start looking smaller. Even though we know they're big, the farther away they get, the smaller they look. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. But like I say, now that I've got all this put in, I could start adding all the little kind of details I wanted to. If I wanted to have little, hooks or little, diamonds or whatever I wanted, like a king's throne has diamonds, stuff like that. I already know that everything's in place. Now I can deal with all this detail. So conceptually speaking, in terms of problem solving, this is like we did from observational drawing. We thought of the bigger, large still life that we were drawing, measured those alignments and proportions right, and then we work our way down to the smaller things. Yeah. Any other questions about this? Just want to make sure everybody's clear. Because like I say, when I first did this, I had a million questions. I got stuck very easily. Okay. So actually, what time? Actually, we're just about at 9 o'clock. I think I've probably fried everybody's brain for about 2 hours worth, even though it's only been an hour. Why don't we take a break, finish laying this in if you haven't done it yet. We'll take a break, and then when we come back, I want to show you how we would deal with an elliptical object from an invention. And then after that, I'm going to start you on how to draw an entire gridded room, and then we can use the grid to place and invent whatever objects we want to invent, okay? Okay. So I just want to take that off so it doesn't become a distraction later, because we use that for a chair. So let's deal with a basic cylinder first, then we could turn the cylinder into maybe a lamp, like an elliptical lamp. But we'll start with the cylinder. So remember when I did the demo before, when I first started talking about elliptical shapes, I related it to the idea of fitting it in the idea of a block, of a square. So to do an elliptical shape that we're inventing, that's what we want to do. We want to first lay in a box in perspective, and then after the box is laid in accurately, we can cross over, find our major and minor axis, our center line, and turn it into whatever elliptical object we want. So let's say that we're going to do an elliptical shape, elliptical object, that is 2 feet over from our center line. So maybe, actually, why don't you guys do this? Why don't you just watch me as I go through this, and then you guys can try to start applying it, because I don't want to lose anybody and get anybody confused. So I'm going to measure over 1, 2, because I want it to be 2 feet over, and I'm going to put in my converging line. And if it's an elliptical shape, that means it's symmetrical all around. That means the width is going to be, the width and the length are going to be the same. So front, the width here and then the length back. So let's say we're going to do one that's 2 feet wide. So from this point, I'm going to go 1, 2. Take that back to my vanishing point. Everything's in 1 point perspective here. So if this is 2 feet wide, I need to decide, do I want this elliptical object right at the ground line here, or do I want to push it back like we did with the chair? And I think we're going to go back 1 foot, just like we did there, just to kind of practice more with the counting back into space. So if I want to count back on this line 1 foot, everybody watching? That means from this point on the ground line, I would go over 1 foot. And then I can line that up with my measurement point on this right side. It's lined up with the measurement point. Cross over, right there, 1 foot back into space. Then I can just bring this line over, and as it hits there, there's the other side of what will be the box we're going to use to make our ellipse. So, okay. Now, this is 2 feet wide. That means from this point, if I'm going to make an elliptical shape, I need to go from this point the equivalent of 2 feet back into space. All right? So if we go backtrack a little bit, this point corresponds, counting back into space, with that point off of the ground line from what we did earlier. Does that make sense? Okay. So that means if I want to go from this point and count back 2 feet back into space, I need to count it back starting here on the ground line. So 1, 2, take that point, line it up with that measurement point again, transfer it back up, and where it hits there, there's 2 feet back into space from there. Now all I got to do is cross over. Now we have our square in space that will be eventually our elliptical object. Okay? Make sense? So why don't we make this elliptical object, we'll make it the same as the chair. We'll make it 4 feet off the ground. So like we did before, there's 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 4 foot. So I'm going to go back on this line, because this lines up with the edge of what will be the box. I'll have a straight line there that I'm going to draw in a second, but I'm going to count up what would be 4 inches there, because I'm just sliding over that measurement tool essentially to here. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 feet. We'll just transfer it over to here. That's 4 feet off the ground, starting at the ground line. However, like we did before, I want to be 4 feet off the ground at this point. So I'm going to take that dot, line it up with my vanishing point, and that's 4 feet off the ground all the way back into space. I want to take this point, and I'm going to go straight up where it intersects that line. That's the equivalent of 4 feet up from that point back into space. So right there, and I'm going to make this just a little bit darker, not too dark because I don't want it to distract from my eventual elliptical object we're going to draw. There's 4 feet high back in space. Now I can go over to this corner, draw a straight line up, and then from that point, a straight line over, and I found the equivalent of the other side. So all I got to do now, because I'm making a box that will be an elliptical shape, is take this back to the vanishing point. And then this is the back corner of the box. That's the other back corner. Take those 2 lines straight up. They'll intersect those lines going back. Then we found the back edge for our box, which is our box essentially in this particular situation will be basically a frame that we're using to build something else. This is one of the reasons that even though it's not that exciting, getting a firm understanding of getting a box accurate in perspective is so fundamental and important to drawing anything else, into drawing figures or anything else. Because that can be, anything can be simplified inside of a box, then you can get the perspective right. So, there's our box, 2 feet by 2 feet. Does that make sense now to everybody? Yeah, okay. I'm going to make the edges a little darker. And I'm going to get a colored pencil to do these crossovers we're going to do for the elliptical shape, just so they don't get confused from this. So hold on 1 second while I get a colored pencil. So, got our box in. So you remember what we talked about before when I was explaining the basic mechanics of an elliptical shape, when we have these issues of foreshortened circles. Now that we have the box, I can cross over. Everybody looking? I can cross over to find where the center is going to be, which will help me find my major and minor axis. So, cross over these 2 opposite corners. These 2. And does anybody remember what goes right in the middle horizontally? What that's called? Major axis. Let's put in major axis. Now, everybody remembers we talked about before the minor axis. Can anybody figure out where the minor axis would be going in this particular situation? Because we had our major axis right there. We have our minor axis that goes from front to back. Can anybody figure out how we'd block that in? Maybe a better question is, should I block it in straight vertical like this or no? If we think about the minor axis going through here, the minor axis is parallel to the right and left side of the box. Therefore, because our object is to the left of our center line, our minor axis is going to go back to the vanishing point consistent with the right and left side of the box. So I'm just going to go to the center right here, line it up with the vanishing point, and there's our minor axis. The drawings we were doing earlier from observation were bottles that were directly in front of us. And in that situation, the center line overlapped the minor axis. But in this situation, the elliptical object is going to be slightly to the left, which is why we have this minor axis working in this kind of fashion, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to do the exact same thing at the top. But you'll notice, because the top is closer to the eye level, I'm going to see less of the opening there, because we're getting closer and closer and closer to the eye level at this situation. But I'm going to cross over in the exact same way that I did with the bottom. Look at opposite corners. Find the center, take my minor axis back to the vanishing point, make a horizontal for the major axis. So there's the top. Yeah? That makes sense to everybody? Okay. So now I can go back with my pencil, curving on each of these turning points. And draw in my accurate ellipse using the box, the major and minor axis as a reference, making sure that I curve around on all these turning points. I don't have anything flush. Because remember, you don't want things in your ellipse that are doing this kind of thing with the point, and you don't want this long horizontal for too long of a time. You want to make sure you're paying attention to those curves. So then I'm going to do the same thing at the top, but obviously the top is closer to eye level, so I'm going to have a more narrow opening from front to back because we're closer to eye level. Right? Now, can anybody think of how we're going to draw in the right and left side of what would be a cylinder? We're going to turn this into a lamp, but I'm not going to draw the whole line in just yet. But can anybody think how we would do that? These are the two far points on the right and left side of the cylinder. So I would just line these 2 points up with the 2 points here. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that I've noticed in the past, periodically students will end up looking at the edges of the box and they'll try to make the edges, hold on. All right, the battery was getting low. So what I was saying is that sometimes I see people get so caught up on the edges of the box that they try to make a line coming off of the ellipse and make it coincide with the edge of the box. The edge of the box here was just a guide to get this framework to do the ellipse. So your right and left sides would be coming up from the center of your major axis on right and left side, lining up with what's going on at the top. All right. However, my intention is to turn this into an elliptical type of a lamp. I don't want it just to be a basic cylinder. So to do that, I would need to think about what else I want going on in this theoretical lamp. So if we think of the top as the top edge of the lampshade, we would have to think, well, how far down do we want the lampshade to go, right? If it's 4 feet overall, let's say the lampshade's going to go down 2 feet or halfway. So again, there's a couple of ways to do that. One is we could just calculate back on this line again, up 2 feet, see where it crosses over there, goes back to the vanishing point. That's completely valid. However, a quick, easy way to do this, because we already know that it equates to 4 feet, and we want it to be 2 feet, 2 is what in relation to 4? Half. So I could just go on this line and find that, just measure to the middle point, and that would be the equivalent to 2 feet, right? I think in this particular situation, either would be valid. Obviously, if we had a box that was an odd number and we didn't want to be in the middle, and we want something like that, then yeah, we would need to go back and calculate like we did with the chair and like we initially did with the height of this box. But considering we're going to do the middle, I think you could just find the section there, and you could always double check it with calculating it to the ground line. So just to speed up the process a little bit. There's the middle. And just to make sure we're going in the right direction, that's 2 inches. I'm going to double check myself. Going up that line that we did earlier. Brings up to there. And that lines up with my mark there, so I know that I am 2 feet off. I did find the height the right way. So, what I'm going to basically do here is draw in the box, just like I did in the ground plane, cross over, just like I did before, find my ellipse, then I can take those right and left sides and make my base of my lampshade. And again, from there I could make it all ornate and detailed and turn it into whatever I wanted, but first I want to make sure that structure is down accurately. Cross over. And just as a quick note, on the midterm test, I may ask you to draw an elliptical object positioned a certain way to the eye level and center line. So this is why we're kind of practicing this now. There's my major axis. There's the center. We're going to take that back to the minor axis, and then I can just build in my ellipse here. And again, this could end up being some type of spaceship, elliptical spaceship. It could be a lot of things. But if I have these elliptical draw-throughs done, then I know how to exactly put all the details in the form, and they'll read believably as they're moving over a form because I've already worked it out. So right here and right here, just go straight up. And then there's my center. There's my center, there's my center. I can just come down now and make a base into my lampshade, or my lamp base rather. Now we've got a lamp built. Does that make sense? Yeah? So to make this room, we have to kind of like in the last things we just did, we got to make sure we decide what do we want to have for this room in terms of how tall, how far do our eyes going to be off the ground plane, and as we draw through this, how wide the room is going to be, and how tall and so on. So first thing, let's do what we did last time, because we have an 18 by 24 paper. Let's go to the center of the paper just to make things a little bit easier. So 12 inches in. We'll put in our center line of vision. And then the bottom of the center line, put your station point. And then let's say we're going to be 5 feet back, kind of like the last one, again, just to make things simple, 5 feet back from the ground line where we're going to have the image begin. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to be 5 inches because 1 inch, like in our last drawing, 1 inch equals 1 foot. So that'll be our ground line. And then we'll put in our 1 inch marks along our ground line. right? And why don't we keep the eye level, we'll keep it consistent with what we did in the last one. We'll be 6 feet off the ground. So from the ground line, we'll measure up 6 inches. If you want to do a different eye level for your homework, that's fine. But for the sake of this practice drawing, we're going to do a 6-foot eye level. EL for eye level, GL for the ground line, there's our station point. And obviously right where the center line and eye level cross, here's our vanishing point. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Yeah? Okay. So we're going to turn this into a gridded room where we can eventually use that grid that's based on 1 square foot to place in our objects. So rather than starting to just draw the objects this time, we're going to have the room laid out and then we'll place the objects in. So from all of these dashes on the ground line, we're going to take a light but clear line right back to the vanishing point. Now, obviously, at a certain point, this is going to start going out of the cone of vision. So in just a second, I'll talk about how you would apply the cone of vision to this, although I wouldn't get overly worried about it in this practice drawing, but how you could kind of make a determination on clearly where the cone of vision would be ending for something like this. So now you can see it almost looks like there's these wooded floor with wood beams moving back into space. Make sense? Yeah. Let me go around and make sure everybody's on track. Okay. So now we want to make the grid in the room, and we're going to use the similar process that we used before when we were counting back in space. And just to kind of explain the logic of this, remember before we had the issue of we were counting back in space on a square, so if we did that diagonal over, we're looking at this from above. Imagine we're looking at it from above. The diagonal over helped us find the opposing side of that square if we're moving back. So let's keep that in mind just for a second. And imagine again that we're looking above this ground plane, like we're above looking straight down, right? So in that particular case, the ground plane would end up looking like this, because we have all our lines going back to the vanishing point, but we're looking from above down on it. So if we keep the idea that we're basing things based on a square, if I can find that 45-degree angle that's cutting across, every time I see a crossover, that would be my guide on where exactly to put my horizontals, and I'd be making the grid. Does that make sense? Right? Because sometimes people try to guess at it, and you don't want to guess it when you're making a very specific grid, because you want to be able to count back in space. You want to use it as a tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to establish our measurement points like we did before. So in this case, we are still with the 11 inches, because I think we did 5 inches here and 6 inches there. So let's go over from the vanishing point to the right side, and we'll put MP1, and we'll do 11 inches over to the left side and put MP2. So what I can do is take a diagonal from the measurement point and really bring it over to any one of these notches, these little 1-inch marks on the ground line. I'm going to go over to the farthest one. And I'm going to just draw right across. So I've got it lined up here on this mark, the far left side, and with the vanishing point, with the measurement point right there. And it's creating that crossover. So at each one of these marks, where it crosses over, that's going to be my guide where I put my ruler up and draw my horizontal across. And little by little, you'll notice that it's starting to get, the grid is starting to get smaller and smaller and smaller, the squares, because we're going farther back in space. So I just want to make a quick mark of where my ruler will line up to make my horizontals. And I want to make a quick note about one area that some people sometimes get confused on. And that would be right here. Everybody looking? Because this is the center line. So I would put a horizontal line here. And because we have our center line right here, if I want to make sure that my ruler is not doing this when I'm drawing my horizontals over, because sometimes people will line up the ruler accurately with one of the overlap marks, but the ruler will do that, or it'll do that, and they'll end up with this grid that's kind of all kind of shifted. If I use this other measurement point, and I line it up right there where that crossover is coming in, ending right there where it should be, right that mark. The crossover points here that I've just created should be on a straight alignment with the other ones. So it means all I got to do is just line them up like that, and I know that I'm keeping my ruler straight. Okay? If they're not on a straight alignment with the other ones, that means I miscalculated something or my ruler shifted in a previous line, and I got to go backtrack myself and find where I made that little shift. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So I got 8 on both sides, so I know that I'm equal. Okay? So now all I got to do is just line those up, make my horizontal line, and I'll start creating my grid. And I'll talk in a second about how we'll think about the cone of vision. And then right there where they cross over, I'm going to put a line there as well. Sometimes people skip that line for some reason, but you shouldn't. Just continue. I'm not skewing my line off. And I did 2 extra lines here, so I'll do 2 extra there to make sure everything stays straight. just extend these other lines. All right, so there's my grid on the ground plane. Does that make sense? Yeah? One quick thing I want to touch on. Everybody look up at the screen. Make sure you're looking up at the screen real quick. Is how to apply the cone of vision. Because if I just keep drawing and I keep extending this grid, at a certain point, things are going to start looking really, really odd and get distorted, right? So we got to go back to that thought we talked about earlier with the cone of vision. So just to kind of clarify what I mean by this, grab a scrap sheet again. If we imagine that this dot is the top of somebody's head, everybody looking? We're looking down at the top of somebody's head, right? And their cone of vision is coming out of their eyes. They're looking straight ahead, okay? And then we have our gridded, floor, right here. Anything that would be here would be easy to see pretty clearly. But if I have something over here or over here, and I try to include it in my perspective drawing, it's going to look distorted, right? And if that's not my intention, if I want to keep things pretty objective and accurate, and I don't want to include distortion, then I need to make sure that I have a clear idea of where the cone of vision is falling relative to the space I'm inventing. So the way we would do that, you don't have to do it on this drawing, I just want to explain how we would do that. What you would do is get a protractor, come down to your station point, because this little dot in the station point really represents the top of somebody's head as if they're looking straight out. It transitions into this depth of space as we get to the ground line. But the way you would apply the cone of vision is you would find, I would recommend going with a 60-degree angle, and you'd have that 60-degree angle coming off the cone of vision with the center line of vision cutting right through the center, which would mean we have what measurement on the right and left side if that's the case. If that's let's say I don't have obviously a protractor right now, but let's just say that's a 60-degree angle. What would this angle right here be? 30. We'd have 30 there. So you want to make sure that center line cuts right through the center of that 60-degree angle. Then you would connect right and left side of this angle all the way up to the eye level. And you would think of that vanishing point like the center of a compass, and you would just draw a circle around, and that would be your cone of vision, and you would know everything inside that circle would be accurate relative to what you set up. Now a problem comes in that, well, when I look at images on a screen, in a book, in a magazine, whatever, we don't usually see circular images. So how do we translate that into a rectangular or square image? So if we think for a second, this is our cone of vision that we've calculated in whatever drawing we're doing. We could go into the cone of vision and crop with whatever format we wanted to use, a square, a rectangle, whatever, and we know everything inside that cone of vision is accurate. But let's say that we want to include everything in the cone of vision. We don't want to crop anything out. We could crop like this, and technically speaking, everything over here outside of that circle would be starting to get distorted. However, the level of distortion just outside of the circle is so minor that it really wouldn't get picked up by anybody and wouldn't become an issue. The farther out we go from that cone of vision, then it becomes more noticeable and more of a potential problem if our objective is to have things really accurate and not have distortion. So my advice is if you have your cone of vision in and you put in a square like that and you want to include some of the things that are just outside of it, it's probably okay because the level of distortion is so technically subtle that it doesn't become an issue. You just need to be conscious of the farther you go away from that cone of vision, the more distortion you're going to get. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So we're not going to apply that here. I just wanted to explain how that went in. So why don't we take a quick break and then we'll come back in a minute. Okay, so we're going to add in a wall that we're going to grid off. And then, maybe it's a question for everybody out there. Based on the grid that we already have down, everybody looking? Do you think you'd be able to figure out how to count back in space and how wide and back and deep to make something based on this? That seemed pretty obvious? Yeah? Okay. So to help with counting up in space, we're going to put the wall in. We're going to grid off the wall so we can use that as our guide. Okay? And I think I'm going to do, for the sake of this drawing so you don't get confused, because I don't want the grid here to get confusing, I'm going to do the wall with red, right? So ultimately, in the context of the assignment you're going to do at home, you would want to decide how wide do you want this room to be and how tall do you want the walls to be. So we're 6 feet off the ground, so obviously the wall is going to have to be taller than that. Maybe we can make this as just a basic, just so it's not overly confusing for this basic 1 point. We can make this into a room like, I don't know, a living room, let's say. Obviously it could be anything, but let's just, for the sake of ease, let's do this as a living room. So let's do the living room, let's see, how wide do we want to be? How about 12 feet wide? And now the next thing we'd have to decide is, do we want to be in the center of the living room, or do we want the viewer to be over to the right or left side of this living room? What do we want to do in this situation? Anybody have any thoughts on that? You want to have the viewer in the center of this theoretical living room, or do you want him to be on the slight right or left of center? Center? Okay. So we're going to do a 12-foot wide living room. We're going to be in the center. That means from the center line of vision, we're going to measure over 6 inches on each side for a total of 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's where one wall will start out. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's where the other wall will be. I'm going to grid the wall on this side. So how tall do we want this room to be? We're standing up. The viewer is 6 feet tall. How tall do you want the room to be? Obviously, we don't want to go off the page here because we only have a paper that's so big. You want to do, let's say, a 12-foot tall room? Yeah? Okay. So that means we need to have, from this point, a line that ends up being 12 inches total. Okay? So this is 6 inches over. We're going to go 12 inches up for a 12-foot tall room. Sure this is straight. So we have a 12-inch line going up, okay? And then for the very top of this room, which would obviously be going out of the cone of vision, but just so we can calculate things, this top point right here is parallel with the ground, therefore it's going to go to the vanishing point. Remember, all parallel lines share the same vanishing point. Okay. And then right here, on this line, that's the corner of the room where the floor meets the wall. So I'm going to go over this with my red pencil so I can clarify that's what the corner of the room, that's where the corner of the room is going to be. I'm going to do the same thing here, so we can have two walls. I'm going to grid the one on the left side. I'm not going to worry about gridding the one on the right now. Line that up and actually make sure it's 12. So, what I want to do along this red line, just like we did before when we were putting the dashes on the center line, I'm going to make 1-inch marks along this red line all the way up, and that'll be equating to 1 foot tall, 2 feet tall, 2 feet tall, off of that vertical coming off the ground line. And then just like with the ground line, once I've got all these 1-inch marks put in, I'm going to take a straight line from each 1-inch mark on that line for the wall and take it back to the vanishing point. Right here, this part of the grid would be right on eye level, so it'd be a straight line. So now we have the wall moving back into space. Can anybody guess how we could quickly grid the wall based on what we've established so far? It's a quick, easy way to do it. We already know that the grid here is moving back and getting smaller at an appropriate rate of change, right? Can everybody see right here where the grid hits the corner? If we just do a vertical line off of each one of those points where it hits the corner of that grid, then we're automatically going to be creating the grid for the wall. Remember to keep your ruler straight when you do this, because if you skew it, it could throw off the grid. Even though it might have been calculated accurately, if your ruler gets skewed, it will throw everything off. Obviously, as we get farther back in space, the grid, distance from one section of squares to the next will get shorter and shorter and smaller because of the distance back in space. How deep do you think we want this room to be? How deep should it be? We got 12 inches across. Maybe 14 feet? So if we go, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I go 2 more sections, we'll be at 14 feet in terms of the depth of the room. That make sense so far? Yeah. Let me come around and I'll check and see how you guys are doing. Okay, so based on what we have now, does anybody look at this and seem to get confused on how you could now use the wall and the grid and the floor together to calculate size and placement based on what we've done earlier and what we've already accomplished here? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So we'll do a couple of objects here as a reference on how you would place things. What object should we put into this room, you think? This could be anything. And I want to keep something basic so it doesn't really kind of fry your brain too much. But what kind of object should we put if we wanted this to be a living room? Or we could change our idea and it's not a living room. But what do you guys think? What would you want to put into the room you're going to draw for your homework? Maybe I could demo something like that and you would have a reference point.
TV?
At what?
A TV or something?
TV. That seems kind of easy. Just a box. Something a little more complex than that. A what?
Sofa.
A sofa? Okay. So let's say we'll have the sofa against the wall. Actually, we'll do this. We'll do a sofa and then we'll do a window above the sofa on the wall, okay? So how wide do we want the sofa to be from back to front? Maybe 3 feet? Sounds roughly about what a sofa would be, okay? How long do we want it to be? In terms of how far back in space would it go?
6.
6 feet? Okay. So we'll do a sofa that is, I'll make a note of this, 3 feet from front to back, and then it's going 6 feet in space, and then maybe we'll have it 3 feet tall as well. Okay. And then why don't we place it maybe 3 feet away from the ground line, okay, and it's going to be against this wall. So if we want to go 3 feet back from the ground line, because we've already got this grid laid in, we can just go 1, 2, 3. That's where the sofa is going to begin. We want it to be 3 feet in terms of back to front. The back will be against the wall, so then we go from here, we go 1, 2, 3. I'll put a heavier line there to indicate the base, where it's touching the ground. And we wanted it to be 6 feet back into space from this point. So from here we'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? And I'll just make that a little heavier. I'll line it up with the vanishing point. We can clarify the actual object from the grid. And then we wanted it to be 3 feet tall from the ground up. So why don't we just go along here where it started. Everybody looking? Back against the wall. Then we can use the grid on the wall to go 1, 2, 3. And yeah, 3 feet is what we wanted. So 3 feet. Right there is the height. So then we have to think, if we go in from this, you have the spot where you have the cushions laying back where you can sit back. So why don't we do from here over, let's do a ½ foot. Let's do 6 inches over. So if we do a quick sketch of a sofa, just to explain what I'm talking about here. This is our sofa that we're going to make going back into space, right? So the spot right here, let's have that be a ½ foot, 6 inches, because we've got 3 feet here, 3 feet here, 6 feet there. So this little depth where we lean back onto it, we'll have that 6 inches, which means we just go back onto here and then measure over ½ an inch, because ½ an inch would be equivalent to ½ a foot, right? Little mark there. Line that up with the vanishing point, and where this line ends up intersecting right there, then we can go straight up, and we know that's the little section. There would be that, right? So watch what I'm going to do, just so you understand this. I'm lining that up with a vanishing point, bringing this up to here, and then I'm going to make the back edge of the sofa against the wall a little bit heavier. Then we can take this and lightly go straight up. And then this line where it meets it, the top of the sofa, go straight over, and right there. Then we would have to decide, if we use this as our rough of the sofa, from here to here, how far down do we want it to be? So in other words, how tall is this backrest going to be, right? So let's say it's going to be a foot, because we have a 3 feet tall. We'll say it's going to be a foot. It'll be like a smaller kind of backrest, right? So that's going to be 1 foot right there. So that means we're just going to go, we want this to go 1 foot down. So I'm going to go over, go 1 foot down, which is right there on the grid, transfer that over to that line we just drew, and there's our 1 foot down. Okay, then we can have our arm rest that we'd be having right there. So go to the, take that over. And then second, I'll address what we would do if we wanted to make it an angled kind of backrest, but keep it in 1 point perspective. So I just, from that point, drew a straight line over. From the corner here, a vertical line up. There's the front upper corner of where the armrest would be. That make sense? Yeah? So what if I wanted this to be a little more in line with what the quick sketch I did, which was slightly at an angle? How would I do that, right? Since we already know where it's going to end right here, all I have to do is decide what type of an angle do I want. Do I want it to be a subtle angle, more extreme? I just have to make sure that angle I'm going to make ends along this line, right? So I could, we use the ballpoint pen real quick. Actually, I'll use the pencil, then I'll use the pen. Let's say I want an angle like that. All I got to do is just draw that in and make sure it ends on that line. And then I know that it's accurate. And I'm going to lighten that up just so it doesn't become a distraction. So essentially, I just pulled that over along the line, okay? So we know that, let's see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah, there was 6. So going back into space, any angle that comes off of here, and here, and here, and here, they're going to go to that vanishing point because we're all in 1 point perspective in this particular situation. So line that up. And maybe because we only have a couple minutes left, I'll finish up this sofa. You guys can watch along. And what I would say to do for your homework between now and next class, try to get the grid for your homework idea drawing completed up to the stage right now, and think about the type of objects you want to put in. And then when we come back on next class, we'll take this room a little bit further, and by that point you'll have some idea of what objects you want in your homework, and we can maybe demo them for this, okay? But what I want you to do outside of class is do this grid again, but do it based on the idea that you want to do, what type of space. And I'm not picky about the space. You want it to be a room in a house, that's fine. You want it to be an airplane hangar, that's fine. So do something that would interest you, but the main objective is to understand and grasp 1 point perspective. So I'm just going to line this up. There's that angle and that angle. And I'm going to go back over this with a ballpoint pen to clarify. Now, here's the back of the sofa. I would just go straight up. Right where it hits that line, there is the corresponding corner. Take this over, and you can see this is the line that came off of the part of the backrest. Where that goes over and where this meets, that's the corresponding corner on the other side of the sofa. And then we've got that angle that we want to do. And then right there, we just do our horizontal. And that back edge there. And now, obviously we want to have some place where we can sit down into the sofa, right? Let's say we're going to go 1 foot up. 1 foot up there. I'm going to transfer that over by just a straight line over. We can do this with the ruler, but just for the sake of time. 1 foot up, right there, over. I'm going to take a line there to the vanishing point. That will transfer the 1 foot measurement over to there. And then I can say, let's say half of this straight up, because we want to have a little small armrest. So I'm going half of this square. It hits that corner here. I can take this back. That line a little darker. There's the inside of that. This line hits right here. That means that's where it's going to be the cushions, the theoretical cushions here. Half of this square over. So I correspond with what's happening on the other side of the sofa. Go up. And then I can take that over. And again, I'm going from the big box-like shape we initially had to the smaller details, if you want to use that word. To find that inside corner, just go straight up. Where it hits this line, that's the corner there. Go straight across. Where this line comes in, go straight down. Where it meets right there, that's going to be where the inside corner where you'd sit down would be. I take that, I line it up with the vanishing point. I can draw that line in, and now I have those in. So I'm going to go over and trace over with the ballpoint pen. Again, it looks very geometric right now, but we could always curve things out later after we have clarified that perspective. So this is just a basic structure of it. That's why I always say details are easy. It's the structure that's the time-consuming part, the most critical part to making the thing feel believable overall. So there we have our sofa and our scene. Does that make sense? Okay. And then the window, we could just use this grid as a guide for it. We want it to be X number of feet tall, X number of feet back in space, and so on. Does this make sense? Anybody have any questions about this?